Well, in our culture today, especially over the last generation or so, what is legal can change dramatically based upon who's in elected office and the makeup of the court system. We've seen over the past, 50, 60 years, a lot of societal norms change pretty dramatically, influencing people who vote, influencing lawmakers, influencing judges. And what we've seen is a lot of things that were once illegal have been deemed to be legal, and things that were once accepted are now against the law. Now, these are two important things. There are two important things for us to consider when it comes to this idea of changing of laws, changing what's legal. And those two things are who gets to make the decision and under what circumstances. Now, even though it might sound like it, I'm not going to address any of today's changing norms or laws, because we are actually in the Gospel of Luke. But what I want to point out is that, number one, Jesus, here in Luke's Gospel in chapter 6, comes up against a group of very powerful individuals who pretty much had complete reign over what was legal in their society, in their culture, in their religion, the Pharisees. The Pharisees basically kind of reinvented or reinterpreted the law to support their own purposes. But Jesus asserts, as we'll see here in Luke chapter 6, that He is the greater authority than they. And the second point that I want to make is that just because something is legal, as we'll see here in this part of the chapter, doesn't make it right. And there is a difference between what is legal, what you can do, and what is right, what you should do. So we're picking up the story here in Luke chapter 6, after Jesus has run afoul of the Pharisees over dining with sinners. If you remember, Levi, the IRS agent of the Israeli Revenue Service, there in Capernaum, sitting in his tax booth, collecting tolls from people along the international highway that passes through Galilee. Whenever I think about that, I always think of some, big freeway with off-ramps and everything, but of course it was just a dirt road. But that didn't stop them from collecting tolls, and Levi had heard a lot about Jesus. And there was one day when Jesus came along and said, Levi, it's time for you to make a decision. Are you going to stick with what you've known and that which has brought you security all your life and has caused you to be an outcast in your society, or are you going to follow me? Yes, you'll still be an outcast in your society, but you will have everything you always wanted but could never somehow quite attain. And so Levi left his business and he followed Jesus. Levi loved it so much, and he loved Jesus so much, that he went around to all of his IRS buddies and he held a party. He said, "You got to hear this guy." And so here they were dining together, and to dine with someone meant you accepted them. Jesus came and was dining with those in that society, and especially the Pharisees would consider to be a sinner. And the Pharisees were upset with Jesus not only because he was eating with them, but because he refused to do the things that they did, and specifically called out ritualistic fasting, which the Pharisees would do twice a week, and even John's disciples. And Jesus told them that his mission was to bring healing to every sinner, not to segregate himself from one group or another based upon their outward appearance of purity or impurity. And of course, we talked about how there was a real irony for Jesus saying, I came to heal the sick. And the Pharisees would never have considered themselves to be sick with sin. And yet they were just as sick as the sinners that Jesus had come to spend time with at Levi's house. And they questioned him on this idea of fasting. Why don't your men fast? You're not really showing how holy you are. And he said that to them, that while the bridegroom is here, the people need to rejoice. There's going to come a time when the bridegroom will be taken away. That's the time when they will fast, but not now. In other words, I think one of the main points that Luke is bringing out from this is that godly character determines behavior, not ritual and not tradition. And so that theme is really repeated in the next encounters that we see here in chapter 6, and we're going to go from verse 1 through verse 16 this morning. We, like the Pharisees, like the disciples, we need to look to Jesus to tell us if something is both right and good. Not our own senses, not our rules, not the changing mores of our society, but Jesus and Him alone. So verse 1 of chapter 6, Luke's Gospel. On a Sabbath, that's an important point, He passed through the grain fields. His disciples were picking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So what's going on here? Why are the disciples suddenly in trouble with the Pharisees? All they were doing was walking along and picking a few heads of grain. They were hungry. They had a need. Well, Jewish law, in fact, says that they ought to be able to do that. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, it says that you shouldn't glean to the edges of your field so that others could come along who were in need and pick grains so that they could have something to eat. So on its face, this was a completely acceptable and legal thing for the disciples to do. The difference is what Luke says at the beginning of the chapter. It was on a Sabbath. A Sabbath, as you know, was the seventh day on a Saturday. It was given to Israel by God, and it was to be a day of rest. Exodus chapter 31 told the Israelis that they were to do no work on the Sabbath day. God gave them the Sabbath, and He commanded them to rest on it. They were to do no work. Now, defining what's work got taken up by the Jewish scholars. In fact, there's a quote in the Mishnah, which is the written rules that the religious leaders in Israel came up with to interpret the law. The scriptures are scant, but the rules are many. And so in the Mishnah, they created 39 rules about the Sabbath, and they put them down in a book. And according to that list of things you could not do on the Sabbath, the disciples were in fact guilty. They were not guilty of one count, or two, or three, but they were guilty of 4 counts of violating the law according to the interpretation of the Jewish scholars written down in the Mishnah. They were reaping, they were threshing, they were winnowing, and they were preparing food. Oh. Now it's interesting to me, I'm picturing this, right? And Jesus and the disciples, they're just walking along. Oh, here's a grain field. Look, the edges haven't been gleaned. We're really hungry. We should probably get some food. And then I kind of picture, between the stalks, the Pharisees, kind of stalking the disciples. Oh, too bad Matt Gustafson's not here. He would give a big guffaw. Anyway, but they were spying on him. We're going to actually see that here in just a moment. That's literally what they were doing. Following the disciples and spying on them and looking for any possible thing they could find that would discredit Jesus. Now, the penalty for violating the Sabbath was pretty severe. So if they were able to find the disciples guilty of something, Exodus 31 says that they should be cut off from their people. That's very serious. So the Pharisees come and they say, why are you doing what is illegal, unlawful on the Sabbath? So Jesus answers a little bit enigmatically, as he often did. He never often gave direct answers to anything. You ever notice that? But he answers them with a story, this one out of the Old Testament. But it's brilliant, as we'll see. So verse 3, Jesus answered them, haven't you read, which I think, by the way, very interesting way of saying it, he's talking to the religious leaders of the day. They would have had the Old Testament memorized in Hebrew and in Greek, and the Mishnah. All these things would have been memorized. And so Jesus says, hey boys, haven't you read this story? Like, you should have known this already. Anyway, he goes, haven't you read what David and those who were with him did when he was hungry? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the sacred bread, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. He even gave some to those who were with him. And then he told them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus answers this challenge, this accusation really by the Pharisees, with two very important points. It begins, as we saw here, by relating a story about his own ancestor, David, that takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. Now, in that story, at that time in David's life, he had been anointed the king of Israel by the prophet Samuel. The current king, Israel's first king, Saul, he didn't like that at all. And Saul became very jealous of David. So much so that Saul started trying to kill David. And he would pursue him wherever he was. And David and his men had been running from Saul. They had left so quick they didn't have a chance to pack any food with them. They didn't even have any weapons with them. They were literally running for their lives, and they came upon the tabernacle. And the high priest at the time, Ahimelech, David said, do you have anything here? The men are starving. We've got to eat something. And Ahimelech said, well, the only food that we have is something called the bread of the presence, the showbread, that they would place every week before the Lord. They would take it warm out of the oven. I mean, you can just picture that smell of freshly baked bread. Isn't that awesome? Man, I just want to cut into a slice, put some butter on that. But they would take that showbread and they would set it before the Lord. When they did that, they would take the cold bread that had been there for a while off. And Ahimelech said, we just took the bread off. Now that bread, according to Leviticus chapter 24, was literally only to be eaten by the priests. It was holy. But Ahimelech said, David, as long as the men have kept themselves pure, they haven't had any relations with women, you can have the bread. And David said, it's as you say, we haven't done that. The men never do that when they're going to go out on a battle or on a mission from Saul. And so Ahimelech gave the food to the disciple, or to David and David's men, and they ate it. So Jesus really is putting the Pharisees in a real dilemma by relating this particular story, because there are a couple of things that Jesus could be suggesting here. Either he's saying that the law was never intended to exclude basic needs, life-saving needs, like eating, or like in David's case. Or he could be saying that the law itself, by the proper authority, could be superseded if there was a legitimate need. I think probably both are really in view here, because Jesus, his overarching message is that he's doing something new. Remember the thing about the wineskins and pouring new wine into old wineskins? It just doesn't work. Jesus is doing something new, something where God is actually becoming a servant to help and benefit mankind, not to make him more a slave of a bunch of new rules. And in fact, in Mark's gospel, Jesus adds, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Pharisees had made men to rule the Sabbath, and Jesus said it's not to be that way. The Sabbath is supposed to be something beneficial, something good, something helpful. And then Jesus makes this astounding statement where he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a really big deal. I mean, a really big deal to those folks in that society, in that culture. And for Jesus to claim that he is the actual Lord of the Sabbath, is an astounding statement for him to make. I think so astounding, it probably just went right over the heads of the Pharisees. They just couldn't do anything with that at that moment. But notice how Jesus says the Son of Man. This was Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself. But this would not have been lost on the Pharisees, or shouldn't have been, because the term Son of Man actually comes out of Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. And if you read Daniel 7, you realize that the picture of the Son of Man that Daniel describes is unmistakably that of the Messiah. So Jesus, without saying so directly, he says, I am the Messiah and I'm in charge of the Sabbath, not you. I get to decide what's okay to happen on the Sabbath. So then, to demonstrate this with absolute clarity, we see what Jesus does next. Look at verse 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. A man was there whose right hand was paralyzed. The scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath so that they could find a charge against him. But he knew their thoughts and told the man with the paralyzed hand, "Get up and stand here." So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, I ask you, he's turning around to the whole group here, the Pharisees are there. He turns to them and he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do what is good or to do what is evil, to save life or destroy it? Rhetorical question. He doesn't wait for an answer. After looking around at them all, I like that. He's like making eye contact with every person in the room. Pay attention. He told him, stretch out your hand, which he could not have done because his hand was paralyzed. He did so, and his hand was restored. They, meaning the Pharisees, however, were filled with rage and started discussing with one another what they might do to Jesus. So we see here in verse 7, and Jesus is there on another Sabbath in the synagogue, and it says that the scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely. Now that little phrase in the Greek means literally to spy on. So yeah, they were stalking Jesus. Yeah, they were spying on him. It also can mean to watch from the corner of your eye. So Jesus is teaching as usual, and sitting among them is a guy with a hand who is clearly paralyzed. Now this man is not going to die right then and there from a paralyzed hand, but the fact that one of his hands was completely useless would have meant he could not have had any vocation in the nation of Israel. He would not have been able to have earned a living for himself and his family. Now again, back to the Mishnah and those rules for the Sabbath. And if you go to our website later this week, calvarynewberg.org, look up the study notes. I actually link to the place in the Mishnah where this is listed, so you can read it for yourself. But the Mishnah says that a man like that could wait to be healed. Didn't have to happen on the Sabbath. The Mishnah says that you can heal only to save a life on the Sabbath. But Jesus here puts a complete new spin on the Sabbath itself. He suggests that to be able to do good and not do it is actually wrong. It's evil. And to show that Jesus is correct in what he's saying, he commands the man to put forth his hand. Now, like I said, he could not have done that previously, but God, the Father, vindicates what Jesus is saying by instantly healing the man's hand. Now that should have settled the matter right there. I mean, it's a miracle. Everybody knew the guy's hand had been paralyzed. He wasn't faking it for an insurance claim. And he was healed, moving that which could not be moved. It was a miracle only God could do. And so God was putting his stamp of approval on Jesus saying that to do good on the Sabbath is the most important thing, not to slavishly follow the rules of the Sabbath. But that wasn't it for the Pharisees at all. It became a turning point, in fact, for them. The Pharisees weren't really looking for the truth. It says they were looking for a way to catch Jesus up on something illegal. But now something has changed. They're not just looking to catch Jesus on something bad. They're looking to destroy him. In fact, it actually says that in one of the other Gospels, or two of the other Gospels, Matthew and Mark. They say that from that point on, the Pharisees sought to kill Jesus. I find that to be really, really interesting. Here, Jesus is talking about giving life, restoring, healing, benefiting. And what are the Pharisees now thinking? We have to kill this guy. We have to take a life. We have to do something that is so clearly violating God's law that there would be absolutely no question about it. So something happened to them where it says that they were filled with rage there in verse 11. And that means an actual irrational anger or even pathological anger. They went a little bit crazy at that point. They'd hardened their hearts toward the Lord of the Sabbath and the Lord of the universe. So why did their minds go from opposing Jesus and trying to do find a way to accuse him of evil to plotting to kill him? Well, I want to point out, I think there's something very, very wise in the story that Jesus chose at this other Sabbath encounter here we see at the beginning of the chapter. Because something that you don't see in what Jesus says, but is contained in 1 Samuel, is that there was somebody else there with David, his men, and Ahimelech there at the tabernacle where Ahimelech gave David the showbread to eat. There was a man named Doeg there. Doeg the Edomite. He was Saul's chief shepherd. Wasn't even an Israeli. Doeg was a spy. Sound familiar? Doeg then went to Saul and he said, I've seen David. He's with Ahimelech, the high priest. And so Saul sought for Ahimelech and the high priests to come to him. And he ordered them to be murdered. Now the soldiers who were nearby with Saul refused to carry out the order. They knew how horribly wrong it was, what a clear violation of God's law it would be. So Saul turns to a man who wasn't even an Israelite, to Doeg, to carry out his plot to kill Ahimelech and all of the priests. And so they did that. It was really one of the darkest chapters, I think, in Israel's history. And one of them escaped, ended up going to David, and so David was able to protect that man and to kind of go on from there. But I think there's a great parallel here between the Pharisees and Doeg. How they were looking to spy out something against Jesus, and they found it, and I think the enemy came in along beside them and said, you have got to go the extra mile here. You've got to snuff this guy out. And they gave in to that. So Jesus knows now he's going to need to organize. And so in verse 12, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray and spent all night in prayer to God. When daylight came, he summoned his disciples, and he chose 12 of them. He also named them apostles. Simon, whom he also called Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And we know that Jesus often prayed. We've seen it several times already in Luke's gospel. This is the first time it's recorded that Jesus spent all night praying. This decision he had to make was that important. So Jesus chooses 12 of his disciples. Obviously, he had a larger group of people that were following him at the time. He called 12 of these men, and he named them also apostles. So they were disciples of Jesus, but then they were named apostles. I think that's really interesting because the word disciple means to be a student. You're an apprentice. The word apostle means to be sent out. And so, for these men who had all belonged to Jesus, and really for all of us, there are two components. There is the discipleship component, where after you come to know Jesus as your Lord and your Savior, you spend time in His Word, coming to studies like this, studying on your own, letting His Word seep into your life. You learn how to think and speak and act like the Master by observing Him in His Word and by observing how He works in your life. And He shows you by contrast where it is you're falling short of His character, and then by the power of the Holy Spirit in your life, He begins to transform you. That's the discipleship part. The second part is the apostle part. Not that we're all apostles in that sense, but we are all sent by Him. Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses." And He said, "Go into all the world, preaching the gospel and making disciples." So we take that character that Christ builds in us and we take it out to the world. We take it out to other people that we rub elbows with. This good news of salvation through Jesus and none other. This transformation of character. And then that transferring of that wonderful news to the lives of other people. So I think the biggest thing that I see from this section that I want to take away, us to take away, is something that sounds very simple, but I think is actually very powerful and very profound, and that is, the law is not the Lord. Jesus is Lord. You know, understanding that fact alone, I think, will revolutionize your life. Instead of memorizing a rule book, and you know, even the Scriptures, even the New Testament, we can interpret it as just a rule book. And we look for something to answer very specifically every single thing we need to do, and then we woodenly follow it. And I don't think that's what the Lord is about at all. He is about us learning His character, having His value system become our value system. The idea of transformation is to transform our thinking into us thinking the way that the Lord thinks. That way, when we are faced with a situation, we don't go, oh no, was that 3 Thessalonians? Where did that go? You know, we have the character of God informing our value system, and then we know better what is appropriate and good in every situation. And I'll tell you the bottom line of what is appropriate and good in every situation, and that is that which glorifies God and encourages others to have a relationship with Him. You can never, ever go wrong in a situation where you're doing that. And I think the second major takeaway here is that rules don't rule, relationships do. In every situation, here's what we need to ask ourselves. How can I help? How can I heal? How can I encourage? How can I build? And how can I serve this other person who is in front of me? The more we know Jesus, the more our values mirror His, the more this other-centered, self-sacrificing love will dominate our thinking. And we'll see that it's relationships that rise above the rules. Let's pray.